1903, the year when newspapermen branded Richard Fleming with a nickname reeking of filth and despair. Dirty Dick. That was how he was called in the pages of the local press. A cruel name? Undoubtedly. Yet according to the journalists of that era, this man touched water only within the walls of prison cells. Who then was this enigmatic figure? By what twists of fate had he been led to such a tragic end? To understand that, we must journey back to the very origins of his existence. The starting point of our narrative will not be a courtroom filled with accusations and verdicts, but a humble dwelling in the very heart of industrial Birmingham. The 1871 census of England and Wales lifts the first veil from the biography of Richard Fleming. The documents record a 7-year-old boy living with his parents in a place called Great Court, located on Brook Street in the Aston district. Such courtyards were typical housing for the Victorian working class, cramped, often unsanitary clusters of homes built tightly together, crammed into every available space behind the main streets. Yet amid this overcrowded world, there existed a strong family unit. Richard shared a roof with his father, John Fleming, a 30-year-old plater by trade, his mother, Catherine, 26 years of age, and his younger brother, Thomas, aged 4. John's profession as a plater deserves special attention. It was a skilled occupation in Birmingham's thriving metalworking industry, signifying that the family belonged to a respectable working-class stratum with a steady income. Even more revealing is what the census enumerators noted about young Richard. In the column marked Occupation, it simply reads, Scholar. Following the Education Act of 1870, which laid the foundation for universal elementary schooling, this single word conveys vital information. Richard attended school. In 1871, he was a child who had a family, a home, and a seat in a classroom, a boy with prospects before him. However, by 1881, the picture had changed catastrophically. Richard's childhood seemed to have vanished without a trace. We first rediscover him not in census records, but in the Criminal Chronicle of the Birmingham Evening Mail, dated the 25th of March. Now 15 years old, Richard Fleming, residing in a court off Coleman Street, appears before a magistrate on charges of obstructing public traffic in the Stevenson Place area. The police report paints a grim picture of his new existence. He was found among a group of ragged street children who sold matches and newspapers and were caught gambling. They were playing pitch and toss, a simple game of chance involving tossing coins toward a mark. When the magistrate inquired about their source of money, the constable's reply was merciless. They begged coppers from passers-by and then gambled them away. These children were a visible symptom of urban poverty, a subculture of survivors whom the authorities viewed as both a public nuisance and a moral threat. The court record reveals a heartbreaking family dynamic. Richard's mother appeared at the hearing and explained to the magistrate that she sent her son out to sell matches but admitted she was unable to control him. This was likely not a confession of parental failure, but rather an expression of utter despair. The few pitiful pennies Richard earned were apparently essential for the family's survival. But that income came at the cost of his safety and his future. The authorities showed not a shred of compassion. An inspector announced plans for a raid targeting 30 or 40 children working in that district, and Richard was remanded in custody for a week, while the court sought a place for him in a reformatory school. This was no idle threat. Reformatories were established to forcibly remove children from what was deemed a corrupting environment, severing their family ties in the name of instilling discipline and labor. Only a few days after that hearing, on the 3rd of April, 1881, the census taker knocked at the doors. We find 2 records from that date confirming the state of Richard's life. The first locates the Fleming household at 56 Court, Coleman Street, Aston, the very address mentioned in the newspaper. His father, John, now a roofer by trade, is recorded there along with his mother, Catherine, his brother, Thomas, now a glass worker, and a new 8-year-old sister named Rose, listed as a scholar. But Richard himself is absent. The second record from the 1881 census reveals his whereabouts. On that very same night, Richard Fleming, his age listed as 14, was recorded as a juvenile inmate in the Birmingham Parish Workhouse on Western Road. The family crisis that had cast him onto the streets had now led to an official separation from his kin. Whether this was the result of his arrest or the outcome of a deeper poverty, he had been placed in a state institution. Richard was, from that moment, officially a ward of the parish. Such a separation at so formative an age must have been a profound psychological trauma, severing his ties to family and delivering him to the mercies of the harsh Victorian poor laws. We lose sight of him for an entire decade, but the 1891 census shows that he had returned to his family, at least for a time. Now 25 years old, Richard Fleming was unmarried and living in his father's household on Woodcock Street in Aston. He possessed something resembling an occupation, a greengrocer, a wandering street vendor. Though reunited with his family, this line of work reveals that he still lived the precarious life of an itinerant street trader, a world apart from the skilled craftsmanship of his father. The family itself had undergone fragmentation. His mother, Catherine, had disappeared from the records, presumed to have died during the previous decade. His father, John, now had a new wife named Mary, and present in the household were his brother Thomas and a new sister, also named Mary. By the turn of the century, the 1901 census shows that Richard had finally severed the last remaining threads tying him to the family home. At the age of 30, he is listed as a lodger at 16 Oxygen Street in Aston. Still unmarried, still a hawker. He lived among other transient laborers, clear evidence of his complete immersion into the unstable economy of inner-city life. The age of 30 given in this census presents a notable inconsistency. 10 years after being recorded as 25 in the previous census, he ought to have been about 35. Yet such discrepancies were common in historical documents, especially for those leading itinerant lives, or frequently entangled with the law. The error could have arisen from several sources. The information about the lodging house's residents might have been provided by the head of household, Daniel Bryan, who could have simply estimated Richard's age by sight. It is also likely that Richard himself did not know or did not care about his exact date of birth, a frequent occurrence in an era when birth certificates were not universally available. Finally, it may have been a simple clerical mistake by the enumerator, who either misheard or miswrote the number. Although this particular record stands out as an anomaly, the ages listed in most of his other documents consistently point to a birth year in the mid-60s. The age given in the 1901 census is almost certainly an error rather than a reflection of reality. It is here, at the dawn of the 1900s, that his life truly begins to disintegrate. The early 20th century marks the final decline of Richard, a period when his existence was meticulously chronicled in the pages of the city's newspapers. On the 24th of May, 1901, the Birmingham Evening Mail described a filthy, unkempt figure named Richard Fleming, a 32-year-old newspaper seller from 11 Oxygen Street. In an act of senseless violence, he had deliberately shoved a woman of frail health from the pavement on Stevenson Place, the very same area where he had once been arrested as a boy. When brought to account, his only defense was the suggestion that he must have been drinking beer. Noting his notorious reputation, the court sentenced him to 1 month of imprisonment with hard labor. His convictions began to accumulate relentlessly. The extent of Birmingham's drinking problem was noted in the Birmingham Evening Mail on the 8th of October, 1901, when a magistrate observed that 22 of the 37 cases heard that day were related to drunkenness. One of those cases was Richard Fleming, a hawker from 11 Oxygen Street, who appeared in court for drunken disorderly conduct on Summer Lane. It was recorded as his 44th appearance before the bench, and he was once again sentenced to 1 month's imprisonment. A little over a month later, on the 25th of November, 1901, he returned. By now he was described as a man without a fixed residence. His situation had clearly deteriorated. He was charged with drunkenness at James Mace's licensed establishment on Cook Hill Street. A police sergeant testified that he had personally seen Richard being ejected from several pubs and had warned him that if he entered another, he would be arrested. Fleming promptly ignored the warning, entered the establishment in question, and was taken into custody. This was his 45th appearance, for which he was fined 10 shillings plus costs, or sentenced to 14 days imprisonment. He was trapped in a relentless cycle of drinking, disobedience, and jail. A significant turning point came on the 20th of February, 1903. On that day, the authorities entered him into the official Birmingham Register of Habitual Drunkards, a document that stripped Richard Fleming of anonymity and cemented his notorious reputation. A card, featuring both front and profile photographs, officially recorded his nicknames, Dirty Dick and Dick the Devil. It provided a physical portrait of a man worn down by life. 40 years old, height 5 feet 2 inches, lean build, black hair streaked with gray, blue eyes and a snub nose. His residence was listed as 16 Oxygen Street, and his occupation as a trader and newspaper seller. This document served as the engine of the blacklist system. It detailed his conviction for drunken disorder on that day, for which he received 21 days of hard labor. The registry was then circulated to pub owners and club secretaries with a clear, legal directive. They were obliged to refuse him the sale of any alcoholic beverages and immediately inform the police if he attempted to make a purchase. The day after this official branding, the Birmingham Post reported the event to the public, confirming that Richard Fleming had become a marked man for every publican in the city. His notoriety grew to the point that his criminal record became a local curiosity. On the 12th of April, 1906, a headline in the Birmingham Gazette read, "Tank's Record Under Threat," comparing the length of his criminal record to that of another local offender. The article reported that Richard Fleming, better known as Dirty Dick, had made his 58th appearance in the Birmingham Police Court. He was charged with unlawful entry onto railway property at New Street Station and sentenced to a fine of 10 shillings or 14 days imprisonment. The last report of him alive is dated the 17th of November, 1908. Recounting the tale of the old offender named Richard Fleming, better known as Dirty Dick, the Birmingham Evening Mail recorded a statement from the police to the magistrates that was both heartless and profoundly tragic. The only time he was known to have washed was when he was sent to prison. The newspapers printed this, cementing the cruel nickname and reducing the deep struggle of a human life to a grim local anecdote. He was again found guilty of drunkenness, and, unable to pay a fine of 5 shillings, he was sentenced to spend the next 7 days within the clean yet unwelcoming walls of Winson Green. The final document in Richard's life story is his death certificate. On the 2nd of February 1909, Richard Fleming, a 42-year-old street trader, died. His life came full circle, ending where his childhood tragedy had begun, in the infirmary of the Birmingham Parish Workhouse on Western Road. The officially recorded cause of death tells the story of his final years. Cardiac degeneration due to alcoholism, exposure, and neglect. Alcohol had weakened his heart to a critical state. Exposure reflected the life of a homeless wanderer. Neglect, both his own and that of society around him, delivered the final, fatal blow. No family member was present. The informant was the workhouse superintendent. He died an institutional death, in absolute solitude. The story of Richard Fleming demonstrates how swiftly life can be consumed by the relentless streets, the workhouse, prison cells, and public shame. It was a closed cycle from which there was no escape. But at what precise moment did everything go wrong for him? Was there a single point of no return, or was his path predetermined from the very start of his existence? These questions compel us to reflect more deeply on the nature of social decline in Victorian England. Examining the trajectory of his life, from a schoolboy to a societal outcast, we observe a systematic dismantling of human dignity. Each arrest, each conviction, each humiliating nickname added another link to the chain that shackled his freedom and potential. The system, ostensibly designed to reform and correct, in reality only exacerbated his decline, turning temporary hardships into a lifelong curse. Richard Fleming's life path is more than a mere chronicle of individual downfall. It is a mirror reflecting the fundamental flaws of Victorian society and its approach to poverty, childhood, and social rehabilitation. To truly understand his story, one must consider the context of the era in which he lived and the forces that relentlessly pushed him downward. Industrial Birmingham in the late 19th century was a city of stark contrasts. On one hand, thriving factories, innovative metallurgical enterprises, and the growing prosperity of the middle class. On the other, overcrowded slums where working families squeezed into unsanitary conditions, child mortality was alarmingly high, and social mobility was virtually non-existent. Courts like the one where Richard was born were notorious for their cramped conditions. Sometimes tens of families shared a single yard, with only one water source and primitive privies. Education, theoretically accessible after the 1870 Act, remained out of reach for many working-class families in practice. Although Richard was listed as a scholar at 7, economic realities quickly destroyed this opportunity. When families faced financial hardship, whether due to the death of a breadwinner, illness, or job loss, children became a necessary source of income. Selling matches and newspapers, as young Richard did, was one of the few ways for children to earn money, but it also meant the end of schooling and future prospects. The reformatory schools threatened to Richard at 15 were not charitable institutions in the modern sense. They were harsh establishments, built on principles of forced labor and strict discipline. Children were isolated from their families for years, subjected to physical punishments, and compelled to work long hours each day. The idea was to break bad habits through hard labor, but in practice, these institutions often produced embittered, traumatized youths with no useful skills or family connections. The workhouse, where Richard ended up at 14 and ultimately died, was a cornerstone of the Victorian poor relief system. But this help was based on the principle of deterrence. Conditions were deliberately harsh to discourage all but the most desperate. Families were separated, men, women, and children housed apart. Food was meager, labor exhausting, and treatment humiliating. Entering a workhouse was seen as moral degradation, a mark of shame impossible to erase. Alcoholism, which consumed Richard's adult years, was an epidemic among the urban poor of Victorian England. Pubs and gin shops were everywhere, offering cheap escape from poverty and despair. For a man without family, stable work, or prospects, alcohol became the only solace. Yet Victorian society did not regard drunkenness as a social or medical problem. It was considered a moral failing, a sign of weak character. Punishment, rather than treatment, was the standard response. The blacklist system applied to Richard in 1903 was an especially cruel instrument of social control. Official branding as a habitual drunkard, with photographs and personal details circulated among all the city's drinking establishments, stripped a person of their remaining dignity. It also made any attempt at reform nearly impossible. The individual became a recognizable outcast, an object of scorn and suspicion, regardless of their actions. The nickname Dirty Dick warrants particular attention. The police claimed that he washed only in prison may have contained a kernel of truth, but it must be understood in context. For a homeless person or a lodger in cheap shelters, access to clean water for washing was extremely limited. Public baths existed but required payment, which Richard did not have. His filth was not a choice, but an inevitable consequence of extreme poverty. Yet society preferred to see it as a moral defect rather than a social problem. The prison system of the time also warrants critical scrutiny. Short sentences for minor offenses, 10 days, 14 days, a month, offered no real opportunity for rehabilitation. Hard labor, breaking stones, working the treadmill, was purely punitive. Upon release, a person returned to the same streets, the same poverty, and the same lack of prospects, now burdened with a new conviction in their record, making it even more difficult to obtain lawful employment. Richard's 58 convictions by 1906 is a staggering figure, yet telling. Each arrest was not a step toward reform, but another turn in a downward spiral. The system offered no escape. It merely ground a person down until nothing remained but a worn-out shell. Richard's death at 42, from cardiac degeneration caused by alcohol, exposure, and neglect, was a predictable outcome of life on the streets. The average life expectancy in Birmingham's poor districts was significantly lower than in affluent neighborhoods, sometimes by 20 or 30 years. Disease, malnutrition, lack of medical care, constant stress, and alcoholism rapidly destroyed the body. The fact that he died in the workhouse where he had once been a child inmate gives his story a particularly grim symmetry. The circle had closed. The Victorian poor relief system returned him to the very place from which his decline had begun. Can we identify a single turning point in Richard's life? Was it his mother's death between the 71st and 81st censuses? His first arrest at 15? Placement in the workhouse at 14? Or perhaps the problem lay in the very structure of society, which offered no real opportunities for impoverished children. The truth likely lies in the fact that there was no single point of no return. Rather, it was a series of successive blows of fate, each narrowing possibilities and worsening his circumstances. Death or illness of parents, lack of social support, a punitive justice system, absence of rehabilitative opportunities, stigmatization and social exclusion. All these factors combined to form an insurmountable wall. Richard Fleming's story is not just the story of one man, but of thousands of similar lives in Victorian England. It stands as a condemnation of a system that punished poverty instead of addressing its causes, that stigmatized and excluded rather than supported and rehabilitated. His life poses questions that remain relevant today. How should society treat its most vulnerable members? Can punishment without support truly reform? And do we bear collective responsibility for those who fall through the cracks of social structures? Richard Fleming died alone, but his story should resonate as a reminder of the cost of social indifference. If this story moved you, please support the channel with a like and a subscription. It helps me continue uncovering these forgotten stories from the past and sharing them with you. Thank you for your attention.